Gabor Mate, as many of you know, is a retired physician who, after 20 years in family practice and palliative care experience, worked for over a decade in Vancouver's downtown east side with patients challenged by drug addiction and mental illness. He is, as many of you know as well, the best-selling author of not one, not two, not three, but 4 best-selling books published in 25 languages, and is an internationally renowned speaker due to his expertise on addiction, trauma, childhood development, and the relationship of stress and illness. I'll give you more details about his website and Twitter details shortly, but first of all, let's hear from the man himself. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to welcome to Scotland Dr. Gabor Mate.
Thank you for welcoming me to your beautiful country and magnificently vibrant city. It's an honor to be invited here and a pleasure to be sharing the stage with many others who work to better understand and therefore to improve the conditions under which we all live. You know, I didn't know about Jimmy Reed until yesterday, and I learned about him when I watched Harry Burns' TED Talk, where he quoted from the same speech that Suzanne cited this morning. And he mentioned that the New York Times said this was the most important speech since Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, and Harry added that in saying so, the New York Times was rather flattering Abraham Lincoln. And then I read the speech and I understood why. And of course, Jimmy Reed's citation of alienation, being a labor leader, was probably rooted in his understanding of Marx from the 19th century, where Marx talked about alienation. And alienation is a good word as a theme for today, because what does it actually mean? Well, an alien is a stranger. So what happens in alienation is we become strangers to something. And the concept of alienation, what do we become estranged from? What do we become strange to? Well, following along Marxist works, we become alienated from ourselves. And I'm going to be telling you that the essence of trauma is actually disconnection from the self. So since we'll be talking about trauma today, I might as well tell you what my understanding of trauma is. Now, you don't have to take on this understanding, but when I speak about it, I want you to know what I mean by it. So trauma, well, when James and Kim were on stage, and Kim was relating that James had asked her, "What happened to you? What happened to you?" That's a great question. Because in a Western diagnostic model in which I was trained, we don't ask people what happened to you. We ask basically what's wrong with you. What's wrong with you? And diagnostic categories assume that there's something wrong with the individual. It's a very different question asking what happened to you. Because now you're no longer asking about some physiological or mental event inside the individual, but you're putting the person in the context of their environment. So that's very important. But when it comes to my understanding of trauma, it's not actually what happened to you. That's an important question to ask. But that's not what trauma is. So trauma is not the ACEs as such. Trauma is not the physical or the sexual or the emotional abuse. Trauma is not the fact that your parents fought and divorced. It's not that your father was jailed, or there was violence in the family, that your parents were addicted, that you were neglected. That's not the trauma. Those are the events that induce the trauma. But what is the trauma itself? The trauma is not what happens to you. but what happens inside you as a result of what happens to you. So trauma is something that happens within. And the word trauma itself comes from the Greek word for wounding. So trauma is a wound. Now, if you can imagine a wound on your flesh, if you're cut by a sharp object, what happens is that there's pain. So trauma implies pain. There's some loss of function, perhaps, and then the scar forms. And the scar is not the same as normal tissue. The scar is hard, so it doesn't feel so much. The scar is not flexible like ordinary connective tissue. So as a result of trauma, we have pain. We're more rigid in our responses to the environment, and we don't feel as much. And that's what the trauma is, what happens inside you. So when we speak about alienation, the first alienation is actually from ourselves. And the essential alienation in trauma is that disconnect from the self. And I'll be expanding on my concept of trauma as the day goes on, but just begin with that. So that trauma basically is a disconnect from the self, which is where recovery comes in. And I might as well give it away right now. The word recovery is interesting, because what does it mean to recover? To recover means to find something. But if you find it, it means it could never have been destroyed completely. It could never have been obliterated. We've just lost sight of it. We lost contact with it. And I'm not going to answer the question at this point, but I'm going to ask you to consider, what is it that we recover? What is it that we recover when we do recover? And in considering this day on trauma and adversity and resilience and recovery, what is it that you want yourself to recover, to find again? What is it that you want your friends and your children and your clients and the people that you work with in whatever field you're in, whether it's justice or health or childcare or education? What is it that you want people not to lose, or if they do lose it, to recover again? So that first alienation is from ourselves. The second alienation is from our work. Now, browsing the web this morning, I found an article that just was published today in Canada, or yesterday I should say. The majority of Canadian men are so stressed out by work that they're sleep deprived, eating poorly, skipping breaks, and dragging themselves to the office even when sick, without realizing the serious damage they're doing to their health. And they found that 81% of Canadian men said their work was stressful, while 60% said their work was impacting the quality of their sleep. Well, Marx said that the second alienation is actually from our work. We become estranged from our work. The third alienation is from other people, and I'll talk about that as an outcome of trauma. Become estranged from others. And the fourth is the alienation from nature. And if we want to look at what's happening to nature in our culture, in our world today, just look at the whole issue of climate change. Look at the movement here in Britain, where people were demonstrating in the tens of thousands. Well, that shows you how alienated the society is from nature. We're so alienated from it that we're actually destroying it. Now, these are major alienations that I'm sure Jimmy Reed today would endorse as being the ultimate challenges to humankind. Having said that, what do we find when it comes to health in this world? Well, I'm writing a new book. It'll be entitled The Myth of Normal, Illness and Health in an Insane Culture. That's actually the title. And what are the facts? Well, the facts when it comes to a quick perusal of my research that I've done for this book, I'm looking at worldwide. In Scotland, apparently, the drug death rate is very high, roughly 2.5 times of that of UK as a whole. And drug deaths are increasing throughout the Western world. In the United States now, every 3 weeks, you have the equivalent of a 9/11. In other words, the number of people who died as a result of the terrorist attacks on September the 11th, was it 2001? That many die every 3 weeks from drug overdoses in the United States. In Scotland, there were roughly 1,000, I think, overdose deaths over the last 3 years annually. In Britain, the numbers are going up. Now, I think last year there were 4,000 drug overdose deaths in Britain as a whole. Or was that just in England? I'm not sure. But think about it this way. If only one person a day was killed by terrorists in the UK, if every day terrorists killed one person a day, imagine the public alarm, imagine the outrage, imagine the mobilization of resources, imagine the sheer energy that we would put into stopping this assault on human lives. Well, many more die of totally preventable causes every day. For example, drug overdoses. And I'm only talking about the illegal drugs. What about people who die of alcohol disease, alcoholic-related diseases, which number again is over 1,000 a year in Scotland alone? What about the ones who die of smoking-related causes? What about the people that die of the other illnesses that are associated with adverse childhood experiences, such as, for example, autoimmune disease, such as, for example, malignancy? Where's the outrage? Where's the mobilization of public resources? Where's the daily discussion in the newspapers? Where's the fevered debate on the broadcast media? Barely even registers. What is that all about? What does it say about our society? That these far more devastating and deadly threats are so far in the background, whereas we keep prattling on about the threat of terrorism as being the major challenge of our society. What is the reason for that shift of focus from what's really going on to something that's it's a real but relatively minor disturbance? The number of children being diagnosed everywhere in the Western world with all manner of disorders, so-called medical disorders, and I say so-called because you'll be hearing from me that these so-called childhood disorders, these so-called childhood diseases, are not diseases at all. They're genuine problems, but they're not. The disease model doesn't account for them. The number of kids being diagnosed with ADHD, with which, by the way, I was diagnosed in my 50s, and I'll tell you about that later on. The number of kids being medicated. In Britain, in the last 10 years, the number of prescriptions for antidepressant medications has doubled. And I could go on and on with the statistics. 1/3 of British adults are now pre-diabetic, apparently. Childhood obesity, 1/3 of British children are obese now, which makes them prone for diabetes and other illnesses. And I could go on and on and on with the statistics. But how are we to understand all this? That's the question. Now, you would think, for example, with a problem like addiction, if we actually stop to think for a minute, if what we're doing is not working, there could be two explanations for it. Let's just focus on addiction for a moment. If what we're doing is not working, there could be at least two possible reasons. One possible reason is that addiction is this intractable, chronic, incurable disease that there's just not a whole lot we can do about it. It's a genetic condition, it's rooted in our inheritance, and damn it, we just don't know how to fix it because it's so resistant to any human intervention. That's one possibility. The other possibility is, could it be that maybe we don't understand it? Could it be that maybe the way we're approaching it simply does not reflect reality? And if that's the case, why don't we take a look at what's going on? We need to have a new look at it. It's entirely possible that it's not intractable, that it doesn't need to be chronic, that it does not need to be so hopeless in its outcomes that we manage to cure only a small percentage, but that actually it's amenable to human approaches if only we knew what it was really all about. So, at least for today, I'm just inviting you, especially those that are professionally trained like I am, to suspend the framework in which you usually think about these things, and let's just see if a different framework might throw more light on the situation. Now, what is that framework? That framework is not new either. Just as alienation is not a new concept, the framework that I'm going to propose now is also not a new concept. So let me give you a couple of facts. There was a study 2 years ago in the United States that showed that the more episodes of racism a Black American woman experiences, the greater her risk for asthma. So the more racism she endures, the more her risk for asthma. We've also known for decades, that the more stressed parents are, the more risk their child has of having asthma. So there's some relationship between stress and asthma. Now it's very interesting. If you have an asthmatic episode in which your lungs have trouble moving air in and out because the airways have narrowed and gone into spasm, and they're inflamed, further obstructing the flow of air, if you go to a physician like myself, you'll be given medications to suppress the inflammation and to open up the airways. The medications, those of you that are medically trained, you know what they are. They're copies of adrenaline and cortisol. The cortisol suppresses the inflammation, and the adrenaline relaxes the airways. What are adrenaline and cortisol? They're stress hormones. We're treating asthma with stress hormones. And we know that there's this relationship between stress and asthma. Now, if you actually look at medical practice, and those of you that are medical practitioners or the recipient of treatment will know this, that in many conditions across the board, we give the stress hormone cortisol. For inflammations of the skin, you go to a dermatologist, you'll be given a cortisol cream. For inflammation of the intestines, like Crohn's disease or colitis, you'll be given steroids, the stress hormone, at some point. Inflammation of the lung, the same thing. Inflammation of the nervous system, as in multiple sclerosis, the same thing. We're giving stress hormones across the board, but in general, as a profession, we don't ask ourselves the following simple question. Gosh, we're giving stress hormones for everything. Could stress have something to do with the onset of these conditions? It seems like an obvious question, but we don't ask ourselves. Now, let me tell you another fact. I just mentioned multiple sclerosis, which is represents really a degeneration of the nervous system, without going into the details. Inflammation and loss of the protective sheath around the nerves. So you become numb and paralyzed, you might not be able to see, and so on. Let me tell you a statistical fact. At least in North America, and I'm pretty sure that British statistics would be parallel to this, in the 1930s, 40s, the gender ratio of multiple sclerosis was about 1 to 1. You know what it is? So for every man diagnosed, a woman would be, more or less. You know what the ratio now is? 3.5 women to every man. Now what does that tell us? It tells us it can't be genetic, because genes don't change in a population over a few decades. It can't be the food or the climate, because that doesn't change more for one gender than the other. There's got to be something going on. That's environmental. It's clear. Now, what that is, I'm not going to say just yet. But I'm going to give you the framework. In Western medicine, we tend to treat organs. Now, let me ask you the following question. I'll ask you a show of hands. If in the last 5 years you've had reason to go to any kind of a specialist, a consultant, an otolaryngologist, a throat specialist, or a respirologist, a lung specialist, or a cardiologist, or a neurologist, or a dermatologist, gastroenterologist, any kind of an ologist, just raise your hand, okay? Thank you. Now put your hand up again if in the course of that visit you asked about your childhood experiences. Put your hand up again if they asked you about stress in your life. Now we see a couple of hands. Put your hand up if they asked you about how you felt about yourself as a person, about your relationship with your spouse. Yet I'm telling you, those questions, I hope at least to indicate to you by the end of the day, were completely relevant to whatever cause took you to the physician in the first place. So in Western medicine, we tend to separate things. And now, I'm not a militant critic of my own profession. It's a beautiful profession with astonishing achievements to its credit. I don't have to tell you that. But I'm not looking at what doesn't work. I'm looking at today at what we miss, I think. So we tend to separate the mind from the body. We tend not to believe that what happens to people emotionally has a role to play in their physiology and therefore their illness and health, number one. And we tend to separate people from their environment. So we see people as discrete individuals and actually not even as whole persons, but more as a collection of organs, each with their own particular set of diseases. Well, in 1977, there was an American physician, an internal medicine specialist, who also developed some expertise in psychiatry. And his name was Dr. George Engel. And George Engel called for what he called a biopsychosocial approach. And he said that the modern practice of medicine, he said, is separates the mind from the body. And we look at molecules, and we look at organs, and we look at cells, and we look at organ systems, but we don't look at the whole person, and we don't look at the whole person in the context of his environment. So he called for what he called a biopsychosocial model, which is very simple. Biopsychosocial simply means that our biology is inseparable from our emotions, and since our emotions are very much modulated by our social relationships, therefore, you can't separate biology from emotions and from our relationships. Now, relationships is the word that Suzanne emphasized this morning. So the biopsychosocial model actually looks at the individual in the context of their emotional lives and their social lives and their particular relationships. So that's the biopsychosocial model, which is to say that life is inseparable, that life is a unit, that life is one. And that's not a new idea either. 2,500 years ago, the Buddha said that, he says, contemplate what he called the interconnected core rising of phenomena, which means that everything that arises, every phenomena that arises is related to everything else. He says, think about a leaf or a raindrop, he said. A leaf contains the sun, because of course without the sunlight there's no photosynthesis, there's no chlorophyll, there's no life. The leaf contains the sky, because the irrigation, the water, and the earth, of course, the minerals. So in that leaf, you don't understand that leaf. See, it's interesting, like, I know this intellectually, but when I go out for a walk outside, I still only see a leaf. My mind is not grasping that that leaf contains everything. And yet that's the nature of life. The nature of life that everything does contain everything else. And this was said really well by the American author Susan Griffin, who said that the story of one life cannot be told separate from the story of other lives. Who are we? The question is not simple. What we call the self is part of a larger matrix of relationship and society. So this idea of the separated, individualized self is a myth. Had we been born to a different family in a different time, to a different world, we would not be the same. All the lives that surround us are in us. So it's from that perspective now that I want to look at first addiction, and then more broadly mental health and physiological health in general. So let's look at addictions. Now, for 12 years I worked in Vancouver's downtown east side, Vancouver being Canada's westernmost large city on the Pacific coast. And it contains an area called the downtown east side, which is North America's most concentrated area of drug use. So that within a few square block radius, we have more people ingesting, inhaling, and injecting illegal substances than anywhere else in North America. And anybody who visits the downtown east side is shocked by the suffering and the drug use, the people injecting in the streets or in the back alleys, the poverty. So I worked there for 12 years. And in my book, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, Close Encounters with Addiction, I describe a scene where there's a memorial service for a patient of mine who died of an overdose. And as I said in other talks of mine, if the success of a physician is to be measured by the longevity of his patients, then truly speaking, I was a failure because my patients died often. They died of overdoses, of course. They died of sometimes suicide, violence, of all kinds of illnesses related to addiction, hepatitis, HIV, and so on, infections of all kinds. And so in this scene, in the second chapter of the book, I describe a memorial service for a 36-year-old woman. Her name is Shannon. She died of an overdose. I look at this small cluster of human beings gathered at the funeral of a comrade who met her death in her mid-30s. How powerful the addiction, I think, that not all the physical disease and pain and psychological torment can shake loose its lethal hold on their souls. Nothing sways them from their habit. Not illness, not the sacrifice of love and relationship, not the loss of all earthly goods, not the crushing of their dignity, not the fear of dying. The drive is that relentless. How to understand the death grip of drug addiction? What keeps Penny injecting after the spinal abscesses that nearly made her paraplegic? Why can Beverly give up shooting cocaine despite the HIV, the recurring abscesses have had to drain on her body, and the joint infections that repeatedly put her in hospital? What could have drawn Shannon back to the downtown east side after her suicidal habit, after her 6 months getaway? Well, what's the answer to that question of what is this death grip? The dominant answer in Western culture, I should say internationally, is that it's a choice that people are making, owing to some kind of a failure of will, moral weakness, a desire for pleasure. Now, if people are making choices that are harmful to themselves and are considered to be asocial, how do we deal with it? Well, we deal with it by trying to prevent them making that choice, by telling them how bad drugs are. So we tell school kids not to use drugs because it's bad for you, and we call that prevention. And let me tell you, it's totally useless. Or we then punish people for engaging in that behavior. Now, how do we punish people? And Harry Burns talks about this in his TED Talk. How do we punish kids in our society? In a 2-year-old, I don't know what the practice here in Britain is, but I'm pretty sure it's the same. In North America, most parents are taught that when a 2-year-old misbehaves, what you do if they will not be brought to order is to give them a timeout. Which is to say, you can't be in my company, you can't be with me because your behavior doesn't please me. So we give them a timeout. And when they become adults, and they still do stuff that is not to our liking, we also give them a timeout, and that's called prison. We say to them, you can't be with us. And as Harry points out in his talk, when a kid is acting out in school, let's say a bully, you say, we exclude you, you can't be with us. So basically, we withdraw from them something that's essential for human life, which is human contact. And that's what we do. And we do this because we believe that addiction is a matter of choice. So it's hard to keep up with the American cabinet these days because it's like a revolving door. One dysfunctional person replaces another. But the most recently resigned Attorney General, the chief law enforcement officer in the US, made the following statement along these lines that addiction is the choice. He said, we need to say, as Nancy Reagan said, just say no. Now, if you don't know this, Nancy Reagan, who was the wife of Ronald Reagan, who was the sole brother of Margaret Thatcher, and when you become the first lady, they call it, the wife of the president, you have to have a cause. You just have to have a cause. So they all choose a cause. Her was drug prevention. Their idea of drug use prevention was to put up billboards on the highway saying, just say no. Just say no. And so now the Attorney General, 2 years ago, made this speech where he said, we need to say, as Nancy Reagan said, just say no. Don't do it. And our nation needs to say clearly once again that using drugs is bad. It will destroy your life. In the 80s and 90s, we saw campaigns stressing prevention. We can do this again. Educating people and telling them the terrible truth about drugs and addiction will result in better choices by more people. Now, just how successful that Just Say No campaign was in preventing drug use is illustrated by the fact that every 3 weeks in America, as many people die of overdoses as did in 9/11. You know, once I was invited to the Senate of Canada. Canada's got a Senate like America. It's not as powerful as the American Senate, but they do debate and discuss issues. And I was invited to address them, a subcommittee of the Senate, on a new drug law proposal which would have made things more harsh for users. And of course, the law was passed. But these senators were asking me all these questions, and I was telling them all the science that I understood about addiction, which I'll tell you about in a little while. But of course, I wish I could say that it went in one ear and out the other. It never even went in one ear. They just kept repeating the same questions over and over again as if I had said nothing. And I finally said to them in a somewhat exasperated state, well, look, senators, you expect me to practice evidence-based medicine. How about you practice evidence-based politics? Because the evidence about the punishment model when it comes to drug addiction is in. It's not controversial. It's completely useless, and worse than useless, it's harmful. And then he said, we can reduce the use of drugs, save lives, and turn back the surge in crime that inevitably follows in the wake of increased drug use. That's not true either. It is not true that a surge in crime follows increased drug use. What is true is that a surge in crime follows increased drug use in the context where drug use is criminalized. It is not the drug use that leads to crime. I mean, yes, if you drink alcohol, which is perfectly legal, by the way, you might become more violent because you'll be disinhibited. And it's also true that crystal meth and the stimulants can make you violent or very aggressive. That's also true. But most of the crime is not drug-fueled crime when it comes to addiction. Most of the crime is around trying to desperately to obtain the drugs that are illegal. And when in North America there was prohibition in the 1920s and 30s, so you couldn't legally buy alcohol, there was a surge in crime. Not because people were drinking more, but because the alcohol was illegal. So there's no evidence behind those statements. I'm not going to spend more time on the choice model. It's just utter nonsense. You've never met, I've never met anybody who ever woke up one morning and said, my ambition is to become a drug addict, or my ambition is to become an alcoholic. That's just not how it works. Though the second model, which is worth considering, because it has a lot of truth to it, without being true, is the medical model. And in the medical model, addiction is a disease. It's the American Society of Addiction Medicine defines addiction as a primary brain disorder. So it's a disease that arises in the brain, and it affects circuits of reward and incentive and impulse regulation and decision making. And because you got this brain disease, you got this disturbed brain physiology, now you've got this brain disease. How does the brain disease arise? It arises mostly because of genetics, about 40 to 70% genetically determined. And then you meet a drug, and now you have this genetically predisposed brain that meets a drug, and now you're hooked. Now the disease model is certainly more forward-looking than the choice model because at least you're not blaming somebody. At least theoretically you're not blaming somebody. You can't blame somebody for inheriting the wrong genes. And if somebody's got a chronic disease, just as you would deal with malignancy or rheumatoid arthritis or chronic depression, you don't blame people for relapsing, and you don't punish them for relapsing. And you also offer them treatment because you get that they're suffering as a result of their illness, and you want to alleviate that suffering. So the medical model is far more humane and forward-looking, but is it adequate? Is it cover the science? Does it take into account the human experience behind addiction? I say it does not. For one thing, it doesn't explain the non-drug addictions. Is there really a gambling gene? Is there really an online video game gene? Number one. Number two, let me give you a definition of addiction that I don't think is controversial. And I'm going to ask you a question. So I'm going to define addiction as any behavior, at least it's a complex process, physiological, psychological, yes, but that manifests in any behavior that a person finds temporary pleasure or relief in, and therefore craves, but suffers negative consequences as a result of, and is unable or unwilling to give it up despite those negative consequences. So the hallmarks of addiction are craving, pleasure, relief in the short term, negative outcomes in the long term, refusal or inability to give it up despite those negative consequences. Now notice that my definition said nothing about drugs. Obviously it does include drugs, substances of all kinds. Could also be gambling, as James was saying this morning, sex, video games, work, extreme sports, relationships, shopping, eating, and one could go on and on and on. So any behavior like that. So according to that definition, craving relief, pleasure in the short term, negative consequences in the long term, difficulty giving it up. How many of you would acknowledge that at some time or another in your life you've had some kind of an addictive pattern? Just put your hand up. Yeah. Well, put your hand up if you didn't put your hand up. Because we want to know how you did it. What I'm saying is that addictions are rife throughout this society. It touches almost everybody. And if you understand what it's really all about, I'm going to ask you a very simple question. And I'm going to ask just some of you in the front row so I can actually hear you to raise your hand if you're willing to and tell me. I'm going to ask you not what you were addicted to, not for how long or when, just whatever it was, whenever it was, what did you like about it? What did it do for you? So if you're willing to tell me in the first few rows, just so I can hear you shouting at me, raise your hand, okay? Yes?
Escape, dissociate.
To dissociate, to escape. Now, let's look at that for a moment. When does a person have to escape? When does a person have to escape? It's when they're suffering. Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Sorry?
And pain?
In pain? So it's escape from pain, is that what you're saying? So pain relief, is that what you're saying? Yeah, so it's pain relief. So escape from suffering, discomfort, pain relief, what else? Yes? Escape from loneliness so that it gives you a sense of social contact. So social relationships, number 3. Take one more maybe. Yes? Sorry? Comfort. Comfort, okay? Now your desire for comfort implies discomfort. Okay? So let's just look at these. Escape from suffering, pain relief, social relationships, comfort. Are all these not genuine human needs? Are all these not genuine, normal human desires? Anything wrong with them? In other words, the addiction wasn't your problem. The addiction was your attempt to solve a problem. And the question is, why were you in pain? And how is it that you didn't have the resources internally to deal with that pain? Or how is it that you're in a position where you didn't know how to ask people to help you with your pain? How is it that you had to escape from suffering? I mean, suffering happens in human life. That's just suffering is a fact of life. It doesn't mean we have to become addicted. We become addicted when we don't know how to deal with the suffering. And there's a reason why we don't know how to deal with that suffering. So that's the problem. Why were you so lonely? There are 7 billion human beings on this earth. Why were you so isolated and incapable of finding human contact that you had to seek solace in an addiction? And what made you so uncomfortable? And if I want to ask those questions, I have to look not at your brain physiology, not at the supposed choices that you made, but at your actual life. At your actual life. So on one level, in other words, I have to ask, like James asked, Kim, what happened to you? That's the first question. Now let's look into addiction in a bit more deeper fashion. But on the first level, on the broader level, on the basic level, it's simply an attempt to solve a problem. And if you want to understand why the addiction, you have to look at, well, what's the problem here? And how did that problem arise in that person's life? What happened to you? That's the first point. Second point is, I was diagnosed myself in my 50s, about 20 odd years ago now, with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And typically one of the traits of ADD, or attention deficit disorder with or without hyperactivity, is poor impulse regulation. In other words, you want to do something, and even though it's not a good idea, you still end up doing it because you can't control your impulses. So a very simple explanation or example of impulse regulation would be, is if I was hungry right now, I hadn't had breakfast perhaps, and you sitting in the front row had a piece of fruit in your hand, and my impulse would be to grab that fruit and bite into it. That's the impulse, just arising from sheer hunger. Nothing wrong with the impulse, but there'd be something wrong if I acted it out. Because it's your fruit, not mine. And I'm giving a talk right now. I'm not getting paid to eat fruit in front of you. So that's okay, because it's a part of my brain right here that says, okay, Gabor, you may be hungry, but that's not appropriate to grab that fruit right now. That's impulse regulation. Now, kids with ADD don't have impulse regulation, Adults with addiction don't have impulse regulation, and I'll talk about that later. And there's another large group of human beings who completely lack impulse regulation. Absolutely lack it. And what do we call those people? Did you say politicians? Yeah. We won't go there. Even larger than that. We call them young children. Infants have absolutely no impulse regulation. What does that tell us? It tells us that impulse regulation has to develop. It has to develop. Now, if a plant in your backyard was not developing, what questions would you ask yourself? You'd ask yourself, what conditions are lacking that promote the healthy development of that plant? Nutrition, minerals, irrigation, sunlight. You wouldn't necessarily make that plant wrong for not developing. You would simply say, what are the conditions that are needed here? Is it possible that when we look at the poor impulse regulation of the addict and the poor impulse regulation of the ADD child, not as diseases, but as failures of development? And as soon as you ask, why didn't something develop properly? What are you actually asking? You're asking, what happened to you? What were the conditions under which your brain developed? How come that the impulse regulation that should have developed didn't? That's a developmental question. And then the second question then is, given that it didn't develop in the first place when it should have, what conditions do you need right now to help you develop those capacities? So what if we looked at this is where the promotion of resilience comes in. What if we looked at these human problems not as inherited diseases or diseases at all, but as problems of development? Then the questions we'd be asking ourselves, what conditions do we have to provide to promote healthy development? Not how do we fix this condition, how to suppress the symptoms, but how do we provide the healthy conditions? So, I was diagnosed with ADD in my 50s, and as I describe in my book on ADHD, Scattered Minds, on the very day I first heard about ADD, and I didn't know anything about it, I was a typical physician, knew nothing about it, but a friend of mine told me that she had just been diagnosed with it, and I recognized myself in her description, and the very day I took Ritalin in a higher than recommended dose. Now, how could I do this? I could do this because I'm a doctor, you see. So you're not supposed to do this, but I did. I went to one of my colleagues. I was working in palliative care at the time. I went to one of my colleagues and said, hey, Bev, I think I got ADD. Can you give me some Ritalin? And she said, sure, how much do you want? And so under the principle that if a little bit of Ritalin is good, then more Ritalin is even better, I took a higher than recommended dose on the very first day I heard about ADD. And I went home. My wife, who blessedly has just left the audience, she'll be back later. As soon as I took the Ritalin, I felt present and grounded instead of this hyperactive jumping on that my mind always does. I was just there, and I was full of insight and love. And Ray, my wife, said to me, you look stoned. So I did go see a psychiatrist. I was properly diagnosed, and the Ritalin didn't work for me, but I was given dexedrine, which is a stimulant, and that helped me. I became a much more efficient workaholic, and wrote my first books with it. It really did help. But what the stimulants do, like Ritalin and dexedrine and Adderall and all these anti-ADD drugs that kids are getting in large quantities these days, is they elevate the level of a chemical in the brain called dopamine. And dopamine is an essential brain product, which I'll tell you about shortly. And it promotes incentive and therefore attention. And there are other substances that elevate dopamine. All the stimulants do. Nicotine does. Caffeine does. Crystal meth does. Cocaine does. Now, in the downtown east side, it would not be unusual for me to have a client come in and say, Doc, I don't get it, but Most people, they do crystal meth and they go haywire. Me, I calm down and I clean my room. They were handing me the diagnosis on a platter. Their substance use was a self-medication for ADD. And it's been shown in studies that about 30% of stimulant users actually meet the criteria pre-drug use of attention deficit disorder. So right now I'm talking about, so if you drink 6 cups a day of coffee, you might as well just diagnose yourself. Now, what I'm talking about now is addictions on the second level, which is that of self-medication. So people self-medicate ADD, and by the way, ADD is a major risk factor for addiction. It's a major risk factor for addiction. People self-medicate anxiety, of course, with tranquilizers, with marijuana, with opiates. People self-medicate social phobia or social anxiety with alcohol. People self-medicate bipolar illness, saliently with alcohol, because alcohol, Vincent van Gogh, the great Dutch painter, he was an alcoholic, he had bipolar illness, and the alcohol brought up his lows and soothed his highs. So that's a common self-medication for people with bipolar disorder. And saliently, people self-medicate depression. You know, when you're given fluoxetine or paroxetine or other antidepressants, the use of which is doubled, as I said, in Britain in the last 10 years. That elevates the level of a chemical in the brain called serotonin. Cocaine elevates it temporarily as well. So people self-medicate depression with cocaine. And saliently, people self-medicate post-traumatic stress disorder with opiates. So in North America at least, and I don't know what the situation in Britain is, but I suspect it's rather the same, that these soldiers who come back from our various adventures in the Far East with post-traumatic stress disorder, they self-medicate a lot with opiates, they become opiate addicts. So on a second level, addiction is self-medication, in many cases. Now let's dive a bit deeper into it now, into the brain. Why is it that the opiate works actually? So opiates have been used in human medicine now for at least 3,000 years. That's the earliest written record of it in China. Opiates are, of course, the most powerful pain relievers that we have. But the opiates don't only soothe physical pain, they also soothe emotional pain. As a matter of fact, the part of the brain that experiences the suffering of physical pain also experiences the suffering of emotional pain. You can see this on brain scans. When you subject people to emotionally hurtful experiences while they're undergoing a brain scan, such as excluding them from a game, the same part of the brain lights up as would light up as if you stuck them with a knife. So pain is pain. And so the opiates soothe that pain. As a matter of fact, if you look at the drugs, it's rather interesting. Cocaine itself is a pain reliever. It's a local anesthetic. It numbs nerve endings. Alcohol has analgesic properties, so does marijuana. And I maintain that all the practices of addiction, whether they involve substances or not, are actually attempted as escapes from emotional pain, from discomfort, from suffering of some kind. And hence, and this is my mantra, if you remember this line, please do, the first question is not why the addiction, but why the pain. And if you understand why people's pain exists in them so powerfully, you have to look at their lives, and by God, you have to look at their childhoods. Now, why is it that the opiates even work in the human brain? But this is really crucial to understanding addiction. The opiates work in the human brain because they resemble chemicals that we have ourselves in our brains, and therefore our brains have receptor sites for them, sites where they exert their effect. So we have an internal opiate system, and our internal opiates are called endorphins. And endorphin means endogenous or internal morphine-like substance. So we have our internal morphine-like substances. Why? If you understand addiction, look at what the endogenous morphine-like substances do for us. What do the endorphins do? What are their roles in the human body? Many. From the gut to the mucous membranes to the immune system, nature uses the same chemical for many different purposes. But in the brain, and when it comes to addiction, what do? Well, first of all, pain relief. So the so-called placebo effect, when you give 100 people an inert tablet, which they think contains a painkiller, and 25% of them will get pain relief, as if you gave them a morphine tablet. They're not imagining the effect. The very belief that they're getting help will trigger endorphin relief in them, and those endorphins are providing the pain relief. So pain relief, physical and emotional, is the first job of the endorphins. Their second job is to make possible the experience of pleasure and reward, of elation, of joy. So in these highly elated, highly charged states, we have a lot of endorphin activity in our brains. That's the second thing they do. Now think about those things. How important is that? Pain relief is essential for human life. You couldn't live without it. Pleasure, reward, joy are essential in human life. As the philosopher Hobbes said, life is short, nasty, and brutish. Or maybe he said short, nasty, and British. I'm not sure. But it is tough life, as we all know. We have to have some pleasure, some joy in it. That's their second function. And their third function is the most important one of all. They make possible a little thing without which life is not possible, and that little thing is called love. And by love here, I don't mean the gooey romantic sentiments, although that's nothing wrong with that. I'm talking about actually the attachment, the pull that drives two bodies together. Now I have to dwell on this for a moment. Gravity is an attachment force. Gravity pulls me towards the earth. It also pulls the earth towards me, which ensures that I'm grounded and I'm not going to float away into the stratosphere. Gravitational force is an attachment force. In human life, attachment is an instinctive, biologically determined dynamic that we share with birds and other mammals that pulls two bodies together for the purpose of being taken care of or for the purpose of taking care of the other. There's an attachment drive. Darren was talking about his son and his adventures with his intestines this morning. And the comedian Jerry Seinfeld, the American comedian Jerry Seinfeld, became a parent 20 years ago or 18 years ago, and he said, it's tough being a parent. He says, it's strange, he says, you're in a room with a human being, and he looks at you, and he's smiling at you, and he's pooping his pants at the same time. You're a 2-year-old, So parents have to pull up with a lot of shit, to coin a phrase. What is it that keeps them going? It's that attachment drive to want to take care of the child. The endorphins help to make that possible. Not by themselves, but they're essential to it. So in a particular experiment, they took mice in a laboratory. Genetically, they knocked out their endorphin receptors, so they had no endorphin activity. These little mice, on separation from their mothers, did not cry for help. What would that mean in the wild? It would mean they're deaf. That's how important the endorphins are. And it wasn't, just like somebody said, that their addiction served to get them out of their loneliness in the downtown east side. I would ask people, what does the heroin do for you? And the kind of answers I would get would be, the first time I did heroin, it felt like a warm, soft hug. Or, Doc, I don't know how to tell you this. This is a 6'2" guy with tattoos and muscles and earring and the whole bald head and the whole thing. I said, hey, what does the heroin do for you? He says, Doc, I don't know how to tell you this, but it's like you're 3 years old and you're shivering with a fever and your mother puts you on her lap and wraps you in a warm blanket and gives you some warm chicken soup. That's what the heroin feels like. No, take that away from people. Put a sign on the wall saying, just say no. and see how far you're going to get. Punish them for having, for some reason, come to the conclusion that without that chemical, they will not experience those states. So that's the opiates. I mentioned the stimulants, elevating dopamine level. Let me tell you about another mouse experiment. This little mouse in the laboratory, you put food in front of him. He's hungry. He hasn't been fed. He will not budge to eat the food. He, in fact, will starve to death. Why? Because genetically, they knocked out his dopamine receptors. And dopamine is the incentive and motivation chemical. Dopamine flows when we're exploring a novel object, a novel environment. You know, Dan was talking about his 3-year-old who picks up every acorn and looks at every leaf and look at that flower, Daddy. High dopamine state of seeking and exploring. It's essential for human life. Dopamine flows when we're seeking food, when we're seeking a sexual partner. And by the way, let me pause here and talk to you about the process addictions, the addictions that don't involve drugs, like gambling, like sex addiction, like shopping addiction. What are those about? I've had a shopping addiction problem myself. I talk about it in the book. And I tell you, when I was involved in my shopping addiction, there was no ADD. I was totally present. I was focused, highly motivated. I remembered everything. I remember to this day almost everything I bought and when and where. This was for CDs. That was my particular focus of addiction. Because I had a high dopamine state. It's not that people are addicted to shopping. It's not what they're buying that they're addicted to. Because what they buy never satisfies them, and as soon as they finish buying one thing, they have to buy something else. Same with the gambler, same with the sex addict. If sex addiction was simply about sex, the solution would be straightforward. And I don't mean to be in any way jolly about a very serious condition, but if sex was the issue in sex addiction, the solution would be to find another sex addict. And now you'd be okay for the rest of your life. But that's not what it's about. It's about the seeking. It's about that high dopamine state of elation and focus and incentive and vitality and being alive. And the question is, why don't you feel alive already? What happened to you? So that's dopamine. I mentioned 2 other circuits in addiction, and then we'll finish for now. I mentioned already impulse regulation. It was actually, I think, a Scottish physician who said that the problem with addiction is not lack of free will, but lack of a free won't. Because what happens is that if you look at brain scans on drug addicts, or any kind of addicts actually, the impulse regulation circuits in the brain aren't functioning well, as I already mentioned. And later on I'll talk to you about why not. So and then stress regulation. Now if you look at your own addictive history, when you were okay for a while, you were not using or engaging in the behavior for a while, and then you relapsed, most of the time the reason you relapsed is because there's something stressful happened to you. Which means that you didn't know how to regulate your stresses. The stress regulation mechanism in your brain had not developed properly. Now, why didn't it develop properly? Well, you know what? I'm going to go into this next and go just a couple of minutes over time, and then I'll pause, because I want to just finish this piece. I'll tell you very quickly why those things don't develop, because the human brain develops under the impact of the environment. We know this. This is. I was going to say it's not brain science, but it is brain science. This is state-of-the-art brain science, not controversial. We've known this for decades, at least 2 decades now. It's no longer debated, and it's not taught in the medical schools. If somebody told me that what I'm about to tell you is taught in the local medical schools, I'd be so delighted to be proven wrong. But in North America, I'm telling you, I have yet to find a medical school where they teach this stuff, even though it's been published in major medical journals. So I'm going to quote from an article that appeared in the journal Pediatrics which is the official journal of the American Academy of Pediatrics, and the articles from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. You couldn't find a more prestigious university, a more prestigious institution. And this article appeared in 2012. And here's what they said about brain development. Summing up decades of consensus on brain research. The architecture of the brain is constructed through an ongoing process that begins before birth, continues into adulthood, and establishes either a sturdy or a fragile foundation for all the health, learning, and behavior that follow. Let me go through that again. So the point is that the human brain develops under the impact of the environment. And the right conditions have to be there. And just as if you were a gardener looking at that little plant in your backyard, the development of the human creature depends even more on the environment. It's even more fragile. It's even more sensitive to what happens. And so which circuits develop? The endorphin circuits, the dopamine circuits, self-regulation, stress regulation, emotional balance, insight, all the functions of the midfrontal cortex. Depends on the environment. Just as if you take a child with perfectly good eyes at birth and you put him in a dark room for 5 years and he doesn't see light, he'll be blind thereafter for the rest of his life because the circuits of vision require light waves. These emotional circuits and self-regulatory circuits also need the right environment. And that's because the human brain has to develop on the outside of the womb mostly, compared to a horse which can run on the first day of life. We can't do that for a year and a half, 2 years. So much depends on the environment. So, they say, the architecture of the brain is constructed through an ongoing process that begins before birth. What does that mean? It means that the prevention of addiction needs to begin at the first prenatal visit at least. Because already what happens to pregnant women has a huge impact on a child's brain development. We know this from animal studies and multiple human studies. So women who are stressed or abused during pregnancy, their kids' brains don't develop properly. Too much cortisol, too much stress hormone is present, and that impedes brain development of essential circuits. This is true before birth and after birth as well. Which also explains why adopted kids are at so much higher risk. Double the risk of suicide, multiple the risk of ADHD, multiple the risk of depression, and so on. Why? Because by definition, they came from a stressed uterus. Any woman that is to give up a baby for adoption is by definition stressed. A single mom, a teenage mom, a poor mom, an addicted mom, an abused mom. Those kids are getting stress hormones throughout the pregnancy. And then they have this tremendous loss of the separation from the birth mother, about which I'll talk to you later. But that should tell us something about the care system as well, of what we're playing with here when we separate kids from their parents and what we have to keep in mind. So, this process begins before birth, continues into adulthood, which brings us to education. Those of you, I used to be a high school teacher, by the way. I decided that was too stressful, so I went to medical school instead. And I taught high school for 3 years. The schools think they're in the business of giving people skills and facts. No, they're not. That's not their proper business. Their proper business is the promotion of healthy brain development. Because the healthy brain will be curious and acquisitive of knowledge spontaneously. And the unhealthy brain, you can't knock knowledge into it. Or if you do, it's gone as soon as the exams are over. And I'll talk to you more about education later and discipline and all this stuff. But what I'm saying is that those of you who are in education, consider that throughout adolescence and beginning in preschool or nursery school, what we're really dealing with here is the development of human brains. That's our most important task. And I wonder how many lectures does the average teacher, student, or educational student, pedagogic student in Scotland actually hear about brain development and the necessary condition for promoting it. probably, again, I'd be delighted to be proven wrong, probably 0. And then they say, this continues into adulthood and establishes either a sturdy or a fragile foundation for all the health, learning, and behavior that follow. They didn't say some of the health, learning, and behavior. They say all the health, learning, and behavior that follow is established in that process. So when kids are not behaving or adults are not behaving, what are we looking at? The products of development. And then the second paragraph, the interactions of genes and experiences literally shapes the circuitry of the developing brain. So it's genes interacting with experiences. And it's critically influenced by, and here they're going to tell you the most important qualities of the parenting environment. And it's critically influenced by the mutual responsiveness of adult-child relationships, particularly in early childhood years. In other words, the most important input into the healthy physiological development of all the brain circuits that I've been talking about, of all the brain circuits that go wrong in mental illness in general, addiction specifically, in ADHD and so on, is the quality of parent-child relationships, the responsiveness, the relationship, again, the relationship. And what's essential for healthy brain development for our children is the presence of non-stressed, non-depressed, emotionally available, consistently available, attuned parenting caregivers. That's the essential condition for healthy brain development. And we'll stop here for 10 minutes and continue with Darren and I. Thank you.